People from all over the world come to see North America's greatest river. That's as true today as it was back in 1854, when a huge party embarked upon a journey along the upper Mississippi that was to make history. Hi, I'm Chuck Strins. We're going to retrace the route of the grand excursion of 1854. Back then, the river was full of surprises, and it still is. But today they're different. We're at Arsenal Island in the state of Illinois. We're at the junction of four cities, the Quad Cities of Bettendorf, Moline, Davenport, and Rock Island, in the middle of the bottom of the upper Mississippi. These four cities are in two states, and they link a nation. Arsenal Island here is in everything from a picnic grounds to a military prison. And today it's something in between. There's a private 18-hole golf course here. Duffers and pros alike are welcome, after they've been cleared at the gate. See that casino? Back in 1854, that spot was the end of the line for the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad. But it was the beginning of the greatest river party in the wilds of the Western world. The railroad moguls wanted to bring paying passengers here from Chicago, partly to get the money they needed to build a bridge and continue on west. The solution? Invite the public to take a free train ride to Rock Island, and then, wait just a minute, and then continue along the wilds of the shorelines of Iowa, Wisconsin, all the way to St. Paul in the territory of Minnesota. It succeeded beyond their most passionate dreams. In fact, they may have overdone it. Instead of one paddle wheeler, they needed 7. Even then, 1/3 of the revelers were turned away. Those who stayed were crowded onto boats designed to hold half as many passengers. Former President Millard Fillmore was among them. We'll come back to the party later. This place was also the end of the line for 1,964 Confederate soldiers who were among about 12,000 prisoners here during the Civil War. More than one prisoner met his end of the line when he crossed the line. It was like an invisible wall to keep the prisoners in place. At first, enforcement was lax, but eventually, if you crossed the line, you were shot dead on the spot. That's why they call it a deadline. It's a term first used at Andersonville and soon adopted for the prison that was here on Arsenal Island. And over here on Arsenal Island is what remains of the first railroad bridge to cross the Mississippi. Built in 1856, just 2 years after the Grand Excursion, it stood here in all its glory, spanning the largest river in the Northern Hemisphere for about 2 weeks. And then it was the end of the line for the bridge. It was struck by a steamboat and went up in flames. Today, if something like that happened, there would be a lawsuit. Back in 1856, when the big bridge caught fire, there was a lawsuit. The railroads hired a young lawyer from Springfield, Illinois to argue their case. We have a special guest to tell you all about it.
This is the bell from the Effie Afton, the steamboat that crashed into the bridge. Perhaps it was an accident, although boat captains around here blew their whistles in celebration while the bridge burned. Now, there was this 44-year-old lawyer who just returned from 2 years in Congress. He was hired to defend the railroads. So he came up here to Rock Island to get a feel for the place, even took some measurements. This man, who would go on to become the 16th President of the United States, argued that the boats and the railroads had to share the river. After all, a person has as much right to cross the street as to walk down it. The jury deadlocked. It was finally decided at the Supreme Court in 1862. The railroads won. Anyway, that's what it says here. I'm just a Lincoln impersonator. I pretty much say what they tell me to say.
Thanks, Lincoln impersonator. This place is called Rock Island because of all the rocks out there around the island. Now the rocks are out of the picture, and here's why. This is lock and dam number 15. It's one of 29 that have brought the Mississippi under control. Before that, river pilots ruled this section, and they still do, but some of the romance is gone. That's what happens when you tame a river. It's necessary for commerce. And to that end, I think I'll buy me a new hat. The river pilots were local folk who kept track of the changing channel in the rapids between Rock Island and LeClaire, Iowa, where I am now. It's a town with a storied history, and Mary Roller is just the person to tell the stories. The people here were mostly river pilots and riverboat builders. Mary is a descendant of both lines on both sides.
Philip Suter lived here on the banks of the Mississippi River with his first wife, then had 2 other wives, 12 children, and 2 of those 12 children are my great-great-grandparents. They were, in fact, my parents' grandparents on both sides. So my mom and dad were cousins. They'd known each other all of their lives. And when they decided to get married, my mother said, "You're never going to be on the river, or I am never going to marry you." So he worked for a while in a foundry, hated it, could not stand being inside. It just bothered him so much. So he went, he learned how to weld, and became a bridge builder. And he, in fact, worked on 3 of the bridges that go across the Mississippi River in this area.
This is Mary's big project now. She's renovating a house built by the first licensed river pilot here on what had been the most dangerous section of the Mississippi River. That was her great-great-great-grandfather, on both sides, like she said. Mary calls this her museum. But up the river about a mile, there's another museum with river exhibits. It's called the Buffalo Bill Museum. Buffalo Bill? That's right.
Well, first of all, Buffalo Bill was born here in LeClaire. He was probably our biggest promoter of the United States around because he took the Indians to the East Coast and to the Europe and showed the people that Buffalo Bill, that he got along fine with the Indians, and he wasn't an Indian killer, and he wasn't a buffalo killer. Actually, he was a friend of the Indians, and he showed the European people that the Indians were not bad people. And a lot of people don't know that he was such a friend of the Indians. A lot of people don't know that he is a PR person for the United States, a well-known PR person for the, and he was the first non-political, non-military person ever knighted by the Queen of England.
William Cody was born just outside of town and grew up here across the road from the Mississippi River. Seems like an odd start for a guy that made his name supplying railroad workers with bison meat. After that, Buffalo Bill traveled the globe with his famous Wild West show. From these humble beginnings, William Cody certainly went far. And so did his house. For a house, that is. The city of LeClaire sold it for $150 in 1933, and it became the basis of the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. Not many houses can say they moved 1,191 miles from home. But then, not many houses can say anything. Unless they're haunted, I guess. You know, Buffalo Bill would still be Willie Cody if he never had the lead to shoot those bison. Where did all that lead come from? Well, some of it probably came from the first lead mine in the country, which is just up the river a bit. This is Dubuque, or what's left of him. No, not there, over here. Dubuque the man is buried here. Dubuque the city is alive and thriving, especially around the ice harbor near the old shipyard. A wave of riverfront development includes a new museum and aquarium and a landing recently redone to accommodate much larger boats, including the Diamond Joe. It's named after the man who was responsible for building many of the ships that traveled these and other waters. If you're over 21, you can take the ride free. Well, it's free if you stay away from the slot machines and the blackjack tables, and if you don't buy a hat. But this is what I really wanted to show you. Dubuque the man made his fortune mining lead. A fair amount of the lead here was turned into gunshot. I mean right here. This is the Dubuque Shot Tower, built in 1856. Shot pellets were created by pouring molten lead from the top of the tower through a series of screens into a tank of water at the bottom. Later, this served as a watchtower over the large riverside lumber yards. In 1911, a raging fire destroyed the lumber and part of the tower, but the people of Dubuque got together and collected enough money to rebuild it so it was just like new. Sort of. Well, I don't know about you, but when I think of Iowa, lead isn't the first thing that comes to my mind. But that's what brought many early settlers to this part of the country. And Dubuque, the man, wasn't the first to come. Back in the 17th century, the acting governor of the territory noticed lead beads on a local American Indian, and that's how Nicholas Perot learned of a place where galena, a type of lead, could be chipped from the walls of a cave. That mine was featured on maps years before George Washington was born. Well, I have a different hat on now because I just came out of the St. John mine here in Potosi, Wisconsin. Quite likely the very mine on those maps, although some people say it was closer to Dubuque. That was a long time ago. Nobody works the mine for lead anymore. Nowadays, Harry Henderson works it for a different purpose. He conducts tours. And while he's busy with that, I think I'll go buy a softer hat.
Now this is called the Galena Dolomite Strata. Galena because it yielded the lead ore. Dolomite, that's the type of base rock. Strata because it's stratified or in layers, which you can see.
Well, that's great, but there are other stories about Potosi that aren't quite so dry.
And yes, there is a 36-verse poem that was written by an ex-miner called The Valley of the Drunken Man.
At one time, this brewery had 80 employees. When Prohibition ended, they were ready.
They literally had trucks waiting a mile and a half along Main Street, which is the only street we have, as you know. They were a hard-drinking, hard-living, hard-working bunch. And in some ways, we kind of think that each generation following them has tried to live up to that, or down to it, whichever is appropriate.
The mines were responsible for Wisconsin's identity, the Badger State.
You should know something about how Wisconsin got its nickname. The first miners that came in didn't have money, and they didn't want to take time anyway to build a decent home. So they just dug into the side of the hill, and they used whatever was at hand. Obviously, that's rocks and timber. And the people said, why, they're digging in like badgers. And the name has stuck ever since. And in those days, when they built a smelter, they would hunt a steep slope, preferably above 45 degrees, and a nearby stream. The galena is a lead sulfide. And what are they getting rid of? Sulfur fumes. And why the stream? For shame, to wash away the waste. Well, you know something? The trouble with the Indians wasn't finished. Black Hawk, a chief of the Sac and Fox Indians, and other leaders said, these new settlers are ruining the streams, and that the fish are dying. Well, you can imagine what was wrong. Not just lead poisoning, but all the other stuff that was being, like the sulfur and all the other trash that was being. So they had pollution and environmental problems way back 160 years ago. And the Indians were smart enough to know it.
Like the Grand Excursion boat ride, Black Hawk, the Sac Indian leader, started out in what is now Rock Island. The war named after Black Hawk destroyed one nation as another expanded. Afterwards, he was reviled by the conqueror, and later loved by its people. Today, his name lives on in schools, sports teams, parks, about anything that comes to mind. One thing's for sure, the man made his mark. Many know his name, but few have heard the story. There's plenty of time to talk about war. We'll get back to Black Hawk later. Right now, let's talk about the water and the land. Remember that first railroad bridge across the Mississippi back on Arsenal Island? Well, before there were bridges, there were ferries. They traveled back and forth across the river all along its shores. And there aren't many left now. This one runs between Millville, Iowa and Cassville, Wisconsin, where we are now. It's only $1 to walk on, $10 if you're in a vehicle, and it's a pretty nice ride. We aren't far from a really incredible place. If you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. The Driftless area, home to valleys and bluffs that seem to wrestle each other for dominance. And here's the perfect person to tell us more. It's Steve Meager from the Cooley Celtic Band. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Chuck.
Steve's band is based in La Crosse, Wisconsin, up the river a piece. When he isn't playing in the band, Steve's a geologist and teaches at Western Wisconsin Technical College. Steve, what the heck's a coulee?
Well, Chuck, a coulee, the word literally comes from the French verb couler, which means to flow. But here, coulee refers to a steep valley that's flanked by limestone or sandstone bluffs. Coulees occur in this part of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. That's also referred to as the driftless area. It's called the driftless area because when the last glaciers advanced from the north about 100,000 years ago, they missed this area. And unlike the surrounding area, here the glacial ice didn't leave behind a blanket of earth material, sand, rock, and soil, what geologists call glacial drift. Instead, the bedrock here was left exposed to erosion by tributaries that lead back to the Mississippi. And in the driftless area, unlike the surrounding area, which has gently rolling hills made of glacial drift, here what we have is a much more dramatic topography where you'll see exposed bedrock bluffs and steep valleys or coulees.
Well, thanks, Steve. That's just the break we needed. How about if you play us into shore?
Sure, that's why you brought me out here.
You find lots of neat stuff when you look for what's there. It's waiting to be discovered if you just go back off the channel a little bit, like I'm doing here. This looks like a winding path, doesn't it? But it isn't. It's a bear. And there are dozens of others around me here, too. The rangers here at Effigy Mounds National Monument in eastern Iowa call this guy Little Bear. He's one of a family of ceremonial bears and eagles and other creatures outlined here about 1,000 years ago. At one time, there may have been as many as 20,000 effigies across southern Wisconsin. Who made them? Nobody knows for sure. Hey, maybe aliens did it. Let's ask Ken Block. He's the head ranger at the park, so he should know. I'll let him tell you about it while I go pick up another hat.
Well, Chuck, you might be surprised to know that aliens would have been one of the more commonly accepted answers back in the 1840s through the 1880s. In fact, when settlers first came into this region, they were puzzled by the fact that there were thousands of beautifully formed, artful-shaped animals in earth stretching from northeast Iowa all the way through the bottom of what became Wisconsin. So perhaps aliens, a mysterious race of giants, people from the mysterious lost city of Atlantis, or perhaps the lost tribes of Israel. Those explanations made sense to people who were, at that time, trying to justify in their minds their reason for digging up the mounds and farming and logging and setting up settlements and eventually setting up what became the states of Iowa and Wisconsin.
Why go to all this trouble to preserve these crude outlines? Well, it's because they're part of history, our history. They're part of us and what makes us human. From our earliest days, we recognize symbols and we use them to communicate our thoughts and our feelings, like these kids. In a way, what they're doing now is helping us all go to another time, back on the Mississippi. Perspective. It's all in how you look at it. And when we go back to understand another time, we always bring our own baggage. The American Indians and the white settlers had a very different view of this land. At first, when mining began in earnest, nobody thought much about it around here. The Indians were too busy making their own living as hunters and farmers. Then, like Harry said, when they saw what the slag was doing to their water, they became a bit perturbed. But it was the ultimate pollution, people pollution, that really started the Black Hawk War. The story, from our perspective anyway, goes like this. In 1804, a number of chieftains of the Sac and Fox Indians met with representatives of the federal government downriver near St. Louis. And at that meeting, they signed over the rights to 50 million acres. Were they, as Black Hawk later suggested, compromised by the beverages served? Maybe. Did they really represent their people? Maybe not. One thing's almost certain. They believed they were allowing whites to hunt on their land. But before long, the place was overrun with settlers. Their corn was trampled. Their cemeteries were plowed. Fences sprung up where they had hunted for generations. One day in 1829, Black Hawk came home from a hunt to find a family of squatters living in his lodge. This broke the bounds of all convention, so he left. In 1832, 3 years later, Black Hawk and 1,000 Sac and Fox men, women, and children returned to reclaim their land. By then, 150,000 settlers lived in Illinois. There was no contest. Black Hawk escaped to Wisconsin, but was betrayed for $100 and 20 horses. The government paraded him across the country as a war trophy. At first, he was hated, but as the tour moved east, his celebrity grew, and he spent his final years attending polite gatherings and hotel banquets. Now, that's the way we tell the story today, and to help, we use roadside markers, like this one. It was erected in 1930, and it's one of many throughout the hills of southern Wisconsin. A few, like this one, are next to newer historical monuments that are meant to clarify some of the inaccuracies and to put the language of the times in perspective. If you don't know where you've been, you'll never know where you're going. Some of the descriptions of the Sac and Fox are not acceptable today. Fortunately, rather than bulldoze the old monuments like a history that never happened, the state chose to add the earlier perspective to our current body of knowledge. And I, for one, respect that.
And speaking of respect, here's one guy I'll respect from a distance. He's a timber rattler, one of only 2 species of rattlesnake in Minnesota, as far as we know. The timber rattler is endangered, which isn't too surprising when you consider the Minnesota climate. Its habitat is in the heart of the driftless area.
Here's what Steve was telling us about. Huge vistas, broad, interesting landscapes. None of this changed when the last great glaciers sculpted much of the rest of the country. This is how it was thousands and thousands of years ago. The river cut back and forth to form this valley and ran maybe even 100 feet deeper back then. It's silted in a little bit. We're at Minnesota's Great River Bluff State Park. And over in Wisconsin, they have their bluffs too. Let's go over and see what happens when bluffs go wild.
Come on! All right, just get going, man. All right. Come on! I'm a big old bluff, and you know I'm mighty tough. If you wanna chill, you're gonna hear about my stuff. Yo, 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 check it out. Now, yo, yo, in the house, in the Casa de Vida.
Who am I kidding? I'm just an old white guy. I don't need rap. What I need's rock. And here's one now. Look, talk about rocking on in. That's exactly what happened here in Fountain City, Wisconsin at the Rock in the House. Yeah, that's what I said, not house on the rock. That's about 130 miles southeast of here. This is where a 55-ton rock came crashing down the side of this bluff behind the Anderson house. Maxine had just rolled out of bed and was in the kitchen when it hit. Now you can visit this wondrous site. It's only $1. Just leave your money in the box if nobody's home. Same with anything you buy, like rocks or hats. Mrs. Anderson got away unharmed, but Mrs. Doubler next door wasn't so lucky in 1901. There was a rock with her name on it. And just outside of town, there's a rock 10 times this big. When it rolled down into another part of Fountain City, nobody got hurt. But if this keeps up, they're going to have to change the name from Fountain City to Flatten City. Okay, enough of this. Let's get back on the Mississippi again. A notable community in Winona, Minnesota is made up of people who live on the river, literally. Winona is one of those places where this great north-south river runs east and west. It's one city that's proud of its slightly off-kilter character. This little Sausalito is home to a score of year-round residents and a lot more who just come out on nice weekends. Dennis Shaleen, a district court judge, had a place here in the 70s, and like the other residents, he had to haul in his water and haul out his trash.
My boathouse right over there, kind of designed that on a napkin one day and got a guy to build it, and they kind of just happened, and that's what happened. My boathouse happened. And I lived there for a decade during the 1970s and went to the courthouse every day on my motorcycle and lived here down here.
Being a judge is handy sometimes. Judges tend to know the law.
Well, this whole half the island that you're on right now, I was one of the first to build a house here, and we were told it was on railroad property, but I said when the railroad kicks us off, we'll get off. Well, they never did because they didn't own it. So it belongs to the city of Winona and has belonged since probably the 1850s.
Sometimes the boathouses upstage the rest of the town.
But what's interesting about it is that Jacques Cousteau came here and he didn't interview the city council, he interviewed people in the boathouses on the river. But I think the city ought to promote it rather than demote it.
But beyond Winona, Judge Shaleen's out-of-the-box, onto-the-boat thinking has benefited literally thousands of communities.
I didn't like the idea of having to fine everybody and put everybody in jail who didn't pay their fine. So I came up with the idea that they work in the parks. I continued to do it, and then the state adopted it, and then it was spread from Minnesota throughout the United States, and now it's throughout the world. So you're standing on the spot of the first community service hours in the world right here.
Community is what this place is all about. There's no phone, no lights, no motor car, not a single luxury. Actually, that's not completely true. There are cell phones and solar panels here, and you can drive right up to some of these places, but not all. Here, every month during the full moon, weather permitting, the residents get dressed, come together, build a bonfire, and share fellowship. Once, this was the land of the Dakota. One of their leaders, one of several named Wabasha, had been given a cap by a white friend. Wabasha's eye had been wounded in a lacrosse match, and he liked to pull the cap down to hide the scar. The cap bore a striking resemblance to this limestone bluff, back when it looked like the cap. But it's gone now. Well, they're both gone, the cap and the bluff. Well, the bluff isn't completely gone. Part of it's right out here. Until recently, limestone sidewalks ran all over Winona. Now only a few are left. Here's Winona and Bob Sebo to tell us more. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Chuck. The sidewalk story is a good one about Winona. The limestone sidewalks were really something that made Winona unique. There aren't many of them left anymore, although I think there is a short stretch on West Wabasha Street if you want to go look for it. The sidewalks did do a number on Wabasha's cap, which we now call Sugarloaf. They mined most of the limestone away from that natural formation. The Daughters of the American Revolution purchased the property back in the early 1920s and preserved what was left. Those are the stories we like to tell about Winona. Interesting, historic, cool stories. A lot of people these days want to hear about Winona Ryder, of course. Born Winona Horowitz, the story goes, at a commune outside of Winona. No record of her birth has ever been found to the best of my knowledge, but the old wives' tales say that that's her connection to Winona.
You know, Winona Ryder isn't the only famous Winona from around here. The original Winona was a beautiful native princess. In fact, Winona means firstborn daughter in Dakota. Winona was promised to one man but loved another. On the night before her marriage, she threw herself from a cliff. It was this one right here. Or maybe it was this one over here. Or maybe it never happened. Whites crave stories of noble natives. There's no way to be certain, but the tale of Winona was probably just that, and a source of amusement to the American Indians who enjoyed watching the whites eat it up. Now that's perspective. And so is this. We're at a place called Lake Pepin, and it's... Here, wait a minute, you got a little bit of water in the lens there? There, that's better. We're at Lake Pepin, near Lake City, Minnesota. But it isn't really a lake. It's a big, wide part of the river. On a beautiful night in 1854, under a nearly full moon, the people on the boats of the Grand Excursion Flotilla were having such fun, so rather than tuck themselves in, they tied their boats together and danced till dawn while they continued on their way to St. Paul. They would pay for it in gold, and the city of St. Paul would pay in reputation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to be there yet. I want to be over here. Something almost magical happened here. There was this guy, see, his name was Ralph W. Samuelson, and he was just 18 years old when he invented water skiing right about here in 1922. What he did had never been done, and now it's a worldwide industry. Something that goes with motorboating like motorboating goes with water skiing. This is one of many water skiing clubs. We're actually back on the Mississippi a bit, down near La Crosse, Wisconsin, about 75 miles south of Lake City.
Here, the River City water skiers meet after school, on weekends, in practically any weather, as long as the water is open. Club director Dewey Schultz can tell us more.
We got 75 members, about 35 to 40 skiing members right now, aging from about 9 years to me, 49 skiing. And the rest are support members. It takes, for every skier in the water, it seems like it takes another half to support them with all the boats and activities going on. Yeah, we compete in actually 3 tournaments each year. We do a pre-tournament, generally in early June, mid-June. Then we go to our state competition, which is mid-July at Wisconsin Rapids. And if we do well there, we'll go on to nationals as we did this year, which was in Waterloo in first week of August. So.
All through the summer at Airport Beach on Wednesday nights at 7, the River City water skiers put on a show. Personally, I don't water ski. Well, I've done it, but I'm not very good. And yet, this is a guy I really admire. Whenever anybody does something for the first time, you gotta respect that person. One of a kind, like the Great Spiral Bridge just up the river. We're in Hastings, Minnesota, not far from the end of our trip. And back in 1854, a rope ferry ran across the river right about here. It cost 10 cents to cross. And then in 1897, it went toll-free. It was progress, and it meant commerce. And before long, a bridge went up. People in Hastings loved their world-famous Spiral Bridge. When it was completed in 1895, there was nothing like it. There's still no match anywhere. Yep, they adore their Spiral Bridge. All sorts of businesses are named after it. You see its likeness everywhere, in every imaginable form. It's on paintings, clocks, lots of postcards, artwork of all types. The only trouble is, there's no bridge. Not anymore. This is all that's left of it. And it wasn't struck by a steamboat. In 1951, the Spiral Bridge, like the ferry, became a victim of progress, and Hastings lost its greatest landmark. In many river towns, there isn't much of a first street, because the bridge that passes over the riverside as well. The unique Spiral Bridge brought traffic around like this to the main street. And there you are, Bob's your uncle. Today, you'll see a thriving business community on 2nd Street, now also known as Main Street. And when anyone dares suggest raising a Hastings landmark, the cry goes out, remember the Spiral Bridge. Well, I don't have anything against this great work of modern engineering, but the Spiral Bridge was one of a kind. There's nothing else like it, nothing in the world, except this. We're at the Little Log House, where you'll find more than a little log house. Oh sure, you'll find a little log house all right. And there are barns, a schoolhouse, trains, hotels, windmills, a blacksmith house, tractors, a bus stop, no bus though, a kiln, a water tower, old cars, more old cars, and trucks.
And this 1/2 scale model of the heart of Old Hastings, Steve Bauer calls this place his hobby that got out of control. This bridge ran across the Yellowbank River near Odessa, Minnesota for 102 years. Then Steve and his band of merry craftsmen got a hold of it and moved it over here.
They brought in all of this stuff. The St. Boniface Church over there was taken down and rebuilt brick by brick. Hastings has no shortage of famous settlers. William G. Leduc was a Civil War hero, then a federal commissioner of agriculture. He helped develop what is now known as patent flour. His classic home still graces the Hastings landscape. And then there's Gumby. That's right, Hastings is where Gumby, the toy, was born. The little green giant of the toy world, created by Art Clokey, launched his TV show in 1956 and his merchandising empire shortly after that. A man named Roger Mosman invented the process for holding flexible wires in the molds. This process is still used by toy companies everywhere. Another man just up the river was interested in molding character, not characters. This landing once led to a settlement that was meant to be the country's most cultured city. It was the dream of Ignatius Donnelly, and back then many people said he was the world's most famous American. In his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, Donnelly convinced humanity that he knew where Atlantis lay at the bottom of the ocean. His book remained in print as recently as 1975. It's still the subject of admiration, in some circles. Donnelly wrote works of fiction, too. Intentionally, I mean. His first novel was Caesar's Column. He finished it in 1889, right after he finished 3 terms representing Minnesota in Congress. His days in office were over, but his firebrand populism was going strong. He set the book in 1988, a century in his future. But Caesar's Column is more social criticism than science fiction. You might even call it social science fiction. In Donnelly's vision of the future, horses provided most of the transportation, along with electric trains. There would be magnetic lights in Manhattan, but no airplanes, or even radio. Instead of the internet, Donnelly imagined a system of pneumatic tubes. Rich plutocrats run the world. They buy themselves fancy titles like Baron and Prince. So Donnelly got that part right anyway. And this is where his town stood. He had the business sense to name it after John Nininger, his partner, the man with the money. Nininger City reached a population of 1,000. A bank panic hit in 1857. And then in 1858, the railroad honchos decided to bypass the town.
Not long after, much of Nininger City disappeared. Literally, its residents moved away and took their houses with them.
As the Grand Excursion of 1854 approached its destination, President Fillmore's daughter disembarked, rode a horse to the top of a bluff, and waved a handkerchief at the flotilla. They couldn't have seen it here in St. Paul, but if they had, they would have thought it meant one thing. "We surrender! Take our money!" You see, one of the great ironies of the Grand Excursion was this. St. Paul saw it as their civic showcase. They had a suitably grand reception planned. It was all set for June 9th. But the boats came in on June 8th. Remember that soft summer float through the night on Lake Pepin? It put the flotilla one day ahead of schedule, and the St. Paul City Fathers just weren't ready. But every huckster on the levee was. After traveling 400-some miles and expecting a nice welcome, the folks of the Grand Excursion were greeted by men looking to make a quick buck.
Had they arrived on schedule, the travelers would have been wined and dined, taken overland to the majestic falls of St. Anthony, fed every delightful victual available as the city boosters looked on. Instead, they were charged $10 each. That's 10 American 1854 dollars to ride in poorly rigged buggies belonging to the lowest class of the riffraff of the riprap. Had they arrived even earlier, about 15 years earlier, they wouldn't have found a St. Paul at all. Instead, they would have reached the uppermost point a steamboat could go on the Mississippi at the time, Pig's Eye Landing. Pig's Eye Landing was named after Pierre Perrin. He was an irascible fellow who camped out in Fountain Cave so named because of its spectacular artesian well. He used the water to make whiskey for the locals. These included other squatters like himself, American Indians, and soldiers from nearby Fort Snelling. Parent was, by all accounts, quite ugly. In a knife fight, a slash across his pupil gave him his name. Pig's Eye Parent moved north long before 1854, when the place got too crowded for him. But had he stuck around, he would have had a great time fleecing the grand excursionists. With over 100 world-renowned writers and editors on the 7 boats, the reports on St. Paul were biting, especially those of the New York Times, which helped spread the word around the globe. It was a tough beginning for St. Paul at the end of the 1854 Grand Excursion. This is where the Grand Excursion ended. It brought hundreds of people to an unsettled land. After seeing it, some returned to break the sod. Others took advantage of the sod breakers. And right here, a cooperative group of farmers found a way to fight back.
By the late 1800s, 2 factors really are cutting into farm profits in this region in the Midwest. That railroads are starting to control the flow of grain out of the Midwest. And a number of big grain merchants get the idea that they can control the marketing of grain in the Midwest. So people like Frank Hutchison Peavy and William Wallace Cargill come to Minneapolis, and they join the millers at St. Anthony and the Chamber of Commerce in Minneapolis. And they begin to control the flow of grain through the Twin Cities and the region. By the 1910s, 70% of the grain in the Midwest is going through the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce and through Minneapolis. So farmers are really trying to find a way, how can we take back control of the marketing of our grain in the Midwest. So they start forming cooperatives in the early 1900s, and one of those cooperatives is known as the Equity Cooperative. What's unique about the Equity Cooperative is that they build the first farmer-owned terminal cooperative elevator in America. So the Equity Elevator in St. Paul was the first time farmers built a terminal elevator in the country. And from that elevator and from that movement, by the 1950s, one of the major agricultural historians said the cooperative movement had become a common thing in America. And then in 1917, they complete the structure and they baptize it with river water, hoping that the Mississippi is going to become a factor in shipping again in the Midwest. The irony is that that same year, 1917, the shipping on the Mississippi dies. There's no through traffic between St. Paul and St. Louis. It's all local for the most part. So they continue to ship by rail. But in the early 1920s, navigation boosters start a movement to revive the river again, and they want a major new navigation project that's going to compete with railroads. The tall structure at this site is the head house. A head house is a structure that delivers grain from the elevators to another mode of transportation, in this case barges. And there's the sack house, which is the low structure next to the head house. And the sack house is a structure that was meant to store sacks of grain or sacks of flours, which is the old way of shipping on the Mississippi. So you'd store stuff in sacks, and then people would have to carry the sacks out to the barges and load them on a barge. It was another farm movement that really led to the first major project on the Mississippi by the Corps of Engineers. In 1878, Congress authorizes a 4.5-foot channel project, which really came out of the Granger movement, a big agricultural movement nationwide that pushed for navigation of the Mississippi. And under that project, the Corps for the first time was going to survey the whole Mississippi River from St. Louis, or the whole upper Mississippi from St. Louis to the Twin Cities, to figure out how they could make it truly navigable and competitive with railroads. So they hired a bunch of engineers to physically survey the river, which they did, but then they needed someone to draft the map from all that engineering data and all those measurements, and they hired Henry Bossy to do that. And so Henry Bossy comes in to Rock Island District of the Corps in 1878, and he begins working on this map of the Mississippi, the first comprehensive map of the upper river. And he completes it in 1887 to 1888, and it's published in 1888. And it's the most detailed map of the upper Mississippi until that time. And then Bossy also goes back, and now he knows the river really intimately, from spending lots of time on the survey, from drawing the maps. Now he goes back and starts photographing it in the 1880s and 1890s, and he really knows where to go, what angles to take, and as a result, his photographs are really spectacular. Bosse's photographs are blue for the most part. Most of the ones we see are this cyanotype image or cyan or blue image. And it comes from the processing of the photographs. It's like a blueprint. There are a number of chemicals that they put together to make it work. And one was potassium ferrous cyanide. And the cyanide, or the cyan, gives it the blue color. And the thing about the blue images is that we have some Bosses that are black and white, but you lose horizon lines and you lose other details. It's really in the blue that the richness and the depth comes. Most professional photographers would not have done something in cyanotype. They would have gone to an albumin print or a black and white print. And what really makes Bosse's photographs unique, that they're getting so much attention and such high notoriety, is that they are blue. It'd be like someone becoming a famous photographer like Ansel Adams with Polaroid images. One of the things to look for in Bosse's photographs that people really should look for is the geometry of the images. There's a clear geometry in the images where he's lining up horizon lines, he's lining up railroads, he's lining up people. He lines up many things in these images, almost like an art composition. Henry Bosse is not just a photographer of the Mississippi. He's got a really unique background. He was born in Germany in 1844 on the estate of his grandfather, General Neithart von Gneisenau. Gneisenau was the primary military strategist for the Prussian army during the Napoleonic Wars. And at the Battle of Waterloo, the day before the Battle of Waterloo, the French defeat the Prussians in their retreat, and the French turn on the English and the Dutch and are defeating them. Gneisenau rallies the Prussian troops, brings them back to Waterloo, and helps defeat Napoleon. Bosse is born on his grandfather gets this estate as a result of his deeds in the war, and Bosse is born to the daughter of Gneisenau and lives there until he's about 21, but he's the illegitimate son of one of the daughters. And so probably when he came of age in 1921, he moves to America, emigrates to America. Bosse ends up in Chicago in 1871. By 1874, he's working for the Corps in Chicago. Then he moves to St. Paul in 1875 and works for the Corps in St. Paul. But by 1878, he's in Rock Island, where he'll spend the rest of his career. And he lives in Rock Island from 1878 to 1903, when he dies at a dinner party from eating supposedly a poisoned can of asparagus.
The river starts north of here, about 250 miles at Lake Itasca. Maybe we'll go up that way someday. But right now, we're going back on the Mississippi. Oquawka, Illinois has no more business in this program than Itasca because the Grand Excursion never came by here. But I just don't care. There's a tale to tell in Oquawka, and I want you to hear it. You may not believe this coming from me, so I'm going to ask Honest Abe Lincoln impersonator to tell you all about Norma Jean, the only African elephant buried on the banks of the Mississippi.
This is the town of Oquawka, and that says elephant. There is an elephant on these shores. Her name is Norma Jean. Her body lies moldering in its grave over there by the swimming pool. Norma Jean was just 30 years old when she passed through here in 1972. After delighting the children of the town on July 17th, she watched as a thunderstorm moved in. Her leg was chained to a tree, a large tree in the park. As the storm grew, her keeper, a noble man named Possum Red, attempted to free her when July 17th proved to be the day of Norma Jean's last performance. Her spirit was taken by a bolt of lightning, but her body was laid to rest here where she breathed her last. But Norma Jean lives on in the hearts of the citizens who celebrate her memory. So the next time you see an elephant in a thunderstorm, remember Norma Jean. pay tribute to a special performer who gave to the end so that we all could enjoy the beauty, the wonder of the mighty African elephant in all her splendor. I thank you. And now I'm going back on the Mississippi.
Thank you, Abe Lincoln impersonator. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Don't mention it.
He's great. One of the best Lincoln impersonators, and a real credit to his kind. He takes his role pretty seriously. He's playing a man he believed could walk on water. In fact, he believes in his character so completely that, uh-oh,